The year is 1960 in a rural village in China, and a farmer wakes up before sunrise. He doesn't ask how much food his family will grow that year. Sadly, he asks how much the state will take. Everyone in the village knows the harvest numbers being sent upward are false. They have to be, because telling the truth wouldn't fix the problem, it would just create a new one. Officials are rewarded for supposed success, not honesty. Failure is dangerous. So grain leaves the village, the reports look good, and people begin to disappear. By the end of that political campaign, roughly 30 million people will be dead. Not because food didn't exist, not because the land failed, but because private exchange had been replaced with quotas, and permission had replaced reality. This isn't an argument. This is history. And once you sit with this long enough, it forces a question that most political conversations purposely avoid. If a system built on compassion keeps producing outcomes like this, where exactly is the failure? Before anything else, there's something here that matters. I didn't start out thinking this way. In high school, I would have called myself a socialist without hesitation. The arguments sounded moral, they sounded humane. They sounded like the grown-up answer to inequality and suffering and poverty and all that. And for a while, I really wanted them to be true. This isn't coming from anger, it's coming from disappointment. Because this isn't about caring or not caring. Every society has people who care. Compassion isn't rare. What's rare is a system that can reliably turn good intentions into good outcomes without breaking the mechanisms that allow people to coordinate their lives freely. And that's what this video is actually about. So this video is not about socialism as a feeling or an identity. It's about state socialism as a structure in the real world, a structure where voluntary exchange is overridden by authority, where production, pricing, or trade are all centrally directed, where coordination happens through rules and permissions instead of prices, where enforcement exists for non-compliance, and worst of all, exit becomes a threat when the system is stressed. That structure appears under many names. One-party rule, democratic socialism, social democracy, mixed economies, it's yada yada, etc., etc. The labels change, but the mechanisms don't. And mechanisms determine outcomes, regardless of intentions. Most debates about socialism begin with goals, fairness, security, equality, dignity, etc., etc. These are good human goals, don't get me wrong, reasonable goals. But no system should be judged by what it hopes to achieve. It has to be judged by how it tries to achieve it. We have to look at the means, not just the ends. Because methods create incentives, and incentives shape behavior, and those behaviors determine results. It's a chain. And this is where something started bothering me in college. Once I began studying economics seriously, not just slogans, but actual incentives and prices, trade, coordination, something happened. Something uncomfortable. The explanations that sounded compassionate stopped matching the outcomes they produced. I kept assuming I was missing something. I kept looking for the exception, like the smarter version or the humane implementation, if you will. But the pattern didn't go away. And once you see a pattern clearly enough times, ignoring it stops being about optimism and becomes more about negligence. So let's talk about coordination. Coordination is the quiet problem that every society has to solve. So how do millions of people decide what to produce and how to produce it and where to send it and how to adapt when conditions change? There are only two broad ways that this happens. One is voluntary coordination, where decisions are decentralized, prices carry information, and failure is more localized. The other is administrative coordination, where decisions are centralized, rules replace prices, and failure is absorbed by authority. You have individuals in a market, and you have a hierarchy, top-up pyramid, if you will, of administrative coordination. Because everything else is a variation of those two themes. Now, imagine you're a factory manager in a planned, centralized, socialist status system. Your job isn't to make something people want. Your job is to hit a number written on a piece of paper by someone you'll probably never meet. And if the number is wrong that they gave you, you're still expected to meet that. And if you miss it, you're punished. But if you lie and hit the number, you could be promoted. No speech about solidarity changes that incentive structure. So, you have to ask yourself one simple question. What kind of behavior does this system select for? It's not necessarily good. The next thing we need to address is the knowledge problem, right? Prices aren't just money. They're information. They tell producers what's scarce. They tell consumers what trade-offs exist. They tell society what's worth doing more of and what's wasting resources. So when prices rise, it's not greed, it's a signal. When prices are fixed or capped or replaced by things like state quotas, that signal disappears. Planners don't gain knowledge for us in society. They lose knowledge for us. They literally drain our society of knowledge by their central planning. And when planners guess wrong, the error isn't just local. It spreads much more, it's much farther. It spreads everywhere at once. So this is why shortages under socialism, they're not mysterious, they're clearly structural. And we get back to the incentive problem in markets. Survival depends on serving others. If people don't want what you offer, you fail. That's harsh, but at least it's honest. In planned systems, survival depends on pleasing authority. That single shift changes everything. Truth becomes dangerous. Appearance actually becomes a currency. And statistics become political theater. People don't become dishonest because they're bad. They become dishonest because honesty is punished. This kind of brings us to the accountability problem. In markets, failure is punished. If you have a bad product, you lose customers. A wasteful business loses money. And a firm that doesn't adapt to the market and to the customers and the consumers, that firm could disappear out of the entire ecosystem. But with state monopoly systems, failure is usually insulated. Programs that don't work get larger budgets. Agency that mistargets get more authority. And the explanation is always the same. They just need more resources. Just $1 more trillion should do it. Just a little more power. Failure is absorbed instead of corrected. Mistakes persist. Scarcity becomes permanent. Temporary measures become permanent institutions. And this brings us to the exit problem, where really socialism, in even the voluntary libertarian sense, you might hear those leftist socialists out there, the real problem here always comes down to the exit problem. Voluntary systems survive because people can leave. If a job is bad, you quit. If a product is bad, you stop buying it. If a service fails, a competitor can replace it. Exit disciplines power. Compulsory systems survive only if people cannot leave. And this is the moment socialism stops being an economic theory and truly becomes statism. Because once exit threatens the plan must be protected. And that's why every socialist system grows. Travel restrictions, currency controls, they license the internet and webs, censorship, they have criminal penalties for informal trade, anything that they didn't write up in their tens of thousands of arbitrary laws, mass surveillance. These aren't just abuses, these are requirements for any system like that. So these mechanisms show up everywhere state socialism is tried, not because cultures are flawed, not because leaders are evil, some are, but actually because the structure demands it. In the Soviet Union, collectivization produced famine and forced labor. Survivors didn't talk about ideology, they talked about empty kitchens and learning when to stay quiet because it was a threat. You can't just speak up and be free. You become a target. In China, political planning produced the deadliest famine in human history. Families boiled leaves and bark just to get some nutrients, while official reports celebrated success. In Cuba, emergency rationing became permanent scarcity. People stopped asking what was available and started asking who they knew. It was a connections game at that point. In East Germany, exit threats produced mass surveillance. Children learned early which words were safe at home and which they couldn't use outside of their home. In Cambodia, ideological enforcement erased markets, money, and property. Just wearing glasses was enough to possibly mark somebody as a potential enemy. Glasses! In Venezuela, price controls collapsed supply. Supermarket shelves became predictable. Empty first, and then guarded. In Zimbabwe, money printing destroyed economic calculation. People were paid in stacks of currency that couldn't buy bread by that afternoon. In India, due to the license Raj, decades of licensing and planning stalled growth until markets were allowed to function. By now, most people concede this history. So now, the proponents of socialism shift the argument. Once historical socialism is acknowledged as a failure, the defense becomes more subtle. They say socialism just means worker ownership. They say that capitalism causes poverty, that Scandinavia proves socialism works. They say markets exploit workers, democracy prevents abuse, and they say that the state restrains corporations. Another thing they also say is that law requires the state. Oh, here's another one. Emergencies justify suspension of freedom. The list goes on and on. And if this video is going to be honest and complete, those claims have to be confronted directly, and not with mockery or slogans, but with the same structural clarity we've viewed so far. Once the historical record becomes impossible to deny, the defense of socialism rarely continues in its original form. We've seen it shift so many times, right? Very few people today openly defend mass planning or one-party rule or the disasters of the 20th century in general. Instead, the argument retreats. It becomes softer and more careful, more reasonable sounding. The claim is no longer that socialism worked before. They shift the goalposts and they say that the claim is that it can work now. But if it's quote-unquote democratic, if it's quote-unquote decentralized, which decentralized centralization makes no sense whatsoever anyway. Oh, if it's humane, it'll work if it's humane. It'll work if it's regulated properly. And this is where clarity actually matters the most, because this is where the language hides the structure. One of the comments you'll hear is, socialism just means worker ownership, right? This is often the very first retreat. It sounds intuitive, even ethical, right? Why shouldn't workers own the places that they work? Sounds reasonable. But this idea only survives as long as you don't ask how it functions in practice. Because ownership is not a sentiment. It is an actual legal and enforceable structure. For worker ownership to exist universally, someone has to, first of all, define who qualifies as a worker. They have to determine how ownership is divided. Somebody's going to have to allocate capital and investment redistribution, right? They have to have some type of way to resolve disputes through all this distribution and redefining. And then they have to prevent any type of alternative options or arrangements. So in every real attempt, that authority is the state. Socialism always has to have a state backing it. Once ownership is defined and enforced politically, workers do not own property independently. They hold access contingent on political permission. Here's the other thing too. If worker ownership were genuinely voluntary, then alternative ownership models would be allowed to exist alongside it, proprietorship, etc., etc. But socialism cannot allow that, because the moment that exit exists, their system dissolves. So voluntary cooperatives already exist in market economies. They do not require socialism to function. In fact, they predated states and socialism. What socialism adds is enforcement, and enforcement replaces ownership with administration. Going on to the next thing they say is capitalism causes poverty. Right? And this claim feels persuasive because it starts from a modern snapshot rather than some historical context. But poverty is not caused by markets. Poverty is actually the default state and condition of humans, of humanity in general. So for most of human history, nearly everyone lived at this subsistence level. We had starvation and disease, and early deaths were normal. Yes, some people lived long, but that wasn't necessarily the norm like it is today, with life expectancies way higher. And it's not just due to infant mortality. What changed that was not redistribution. It was productivity. There was trade and specialization and capital accumulation and innovation. Where markets expand, absolute poverty collapses. And where markets are strangled, poverty persists. This is not ideology. It is observable across cultures and continents. Markets do not guarantee equality, but they do generate abundance. And abundance is what makes dignity possible in the first place. And when I say equality here, I mean under financial equality. You can have, in markets, everyone being treated under the same laws and rules. The other statement they like to make is Scandinavian countries prove socialism works, right? This is one of the biggest ones that they lean on. And this is the most common modern claim, but it's also one of the most misleading claims to me, because countries like Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Finland are not socialist systems. They did not abolish private property. They did not replace prices with quotas. They do not eliminate profit. They don't centralize production decisions, and they don't restrict capital mobility. Their economies are coordinated through markets. Firms respond to profit and loss. Businesses fail, workers quit, capital moves. This is capitalism by mechanism, regardless of tax rates. So their welfare states are funded by market output, not in place of it. And the timeline matters. These countries became wealthy before expanding the welfare states, not because of them. Even more important is what has happened when they experimented with heavier state ownership in the 1970s and 1980s. They faced growth that slowed tremendously. Capital fled. Unemployment rates rose. The response was not doubling down. Instead, they privatized industries. They reduced corporate tax rates. They expanded competition. They liberalized markets in a way, not liberalized as in leftist Democrat, liberalized as in economic freedom. So modern Nordic success correlates with retreat from socialism, not its expansion. Confusing redistribution with coordination is how this myth survives. Another one I hear a lot is markets exploit workers, right? This argument depends entirely on how exploitation is defined. Exploitation requires coercion or lack of exit. A voluntary wage agreement only occurs if both sides are actually believed to benefit. They're not going to do it without that. So if workers lack bargaining power, the problem is not markets. The problem is a lack of alternatives. Markets are what create those alternatives, right? Competition gives workers option. Mobility gives workers leverage. But central planning removes those options. When employment is controlled by the state, refusal becomes an actual political risk. That is the real exploitation. Not because wages exist, but because exit disappears under socialism. Another one they like to say is healthcare and education fail because they aren't socialized enough, right? Healthcare and education are often treated as these exceptions to economic logic, right? For some reason, they exist outside of normals, politics and economics. There's some magic there, I guess. But they aren't. It's just a myth. They are among the most regulated and subsidized sectors in modern economies. So when you hear people say they're not regulated enough, it's the complete opposite. These institutions are the most heavily regulated today. And you'll find that prices rise where there is competition restricted, where licensing is politicized, where supply is artificially limited, and where third-party payment dominates. When consumers are insulated from prices and providers are insulated from competition, costs rise and quality stagnates. Adding more of the same constraints does not solve problems created by those constraints. If anything, it entrenches them. Once again, this is not ideological. It is just pure basic incentives. Another one that they like to say is, socialists will sometimes say, greed is the problem, right? Here's the thing, greed exists under every system. It always has. The question is not whether people are greedy. The question is whether greed is constrained by competition or, worse, protected by power. So in markets, greed is punished through loss. If you overcharge or underdeliver, customers leave. But in political systems like socialism, greed is rewarded through monopoly authority and budget expansion. So the problem is not human nature. The problem is unchecked power. Another one they like to use is inequality proves the system is broken, right? But inequality is emotionally powerful, but it's not an economic diagnosis. So inequality is not harm. Poverty is harm. A system where some succeed greatly while others steadily improve is preferable to one where everyone stagnates equally. What matters is rising living standards, opportunity, and the ability for exit, contestable arrangements. So envy is not an economic metric. Actual outcomes are. Another one they like to say is democratic control prevents abuse, right? Democracy is the best and it helps us all and it's going to save us. But this belief is comforting, but it's extremely and deeply misleading. Voting does not eliminate coercion. It only changes who authorizes it. 51% can still impose rules on 49%. Democratic states expand power just as aggressively as other forms of rule. Democracy changes rulers, but it doesn't change incentives. So a bad policy does not become less harmful because it was voted on. It's like a popularity contest too, on top of it. It's way better to let consumers in the marketplace do what they want and choose the product that they feel are best than to try to have central planners plan all that. Another one they like to say is that the state restrains corporations, right? And this is one of the last emotional anchors of statism, is that the idea that without the state, private power would just over-dominate us and we'd have, democide through private institutions, I guess. But history shows just the opposite. So large, durable corporate power structures, they almost always depend on the state, not want to minimize it. Regulations, they raise barriers to entry, pushing out smaller competitors. Licensing actually helps protect incumbents too. You'll have things, the bigger companies get bailouts, which socialize losses while they still are allowed to privatize their gains. And then some of these big companies, they get subsidies, even for failure. So you're rewarding failure. Talk about moral hazards, right? You also have intellectual property that creates artificial monopolies. That's a whole other area we could go down another day. But lobbying only matters where the state has power to grant favors. The state does not restrain power. It decides which power is allowed to exist. Now, markets discipline firms through competition, but states shield companies through privilege. Another thing they'll say is that some things just require the state. This is usually one of the last ones that they'll throw at you. They'll come at you with roads, courts, any kind of defense, basic infrastructure, right? But calling something important does not justify monopoly control or coercive funding. Provision does not require monopoly. Coordination does not require centralization. In fact, it requires the opposite. Funding does not require force. What monopolies eliminate is feedback. Once monopoly is imposed, costs rise, quality falls, and once again, exit disappears. Exit's one of the most important things. If you can't get a theme out of this, if there's one thing you take away from this, exit is one of the most important things here. The market allows it, socialism, statism doesn't. The question is not whether something matters. The question is whether force improves it. Another one they like to use is that law requires the state, right? This belief sits beneath almost every statist argument that you find out there. But law is not created by legislatures, right? Legislatures create statutes. But law emerges wherever people interact and need predictable rules. So those pop up through contracts, arbitration, norms, through reputation theory. Most disputes today are resolved outside criminal courts. Law existed before modern states. Order does not require monopoly violence, right? It requires legitimacy and consent, things that the state cannot provide. So once the language is stripped away, every version of socialism and statism rests on the same assumption that some people should have authority to override others for their own good. Once that premise is accepted, the only remaining question is scale. And scale determines how much enforcement is required. So at some point, many people feel cornered. If socialism fails and statism fails, they feel the alternative must be chaos. But that fear misunderstands how much of life already works without permission and central control. That's where the final piece of the story actually starts. It's the beginning of a whole new world. So let's look at what actually works and why power keeps returning and what the patterns ultimately show. It's at this point in the conversation something usually goes unspoken, and even people who agree with most of what you've heard still feel uneasy, right? If socialism fails and the state itself creates these problems, then what replaces it? Because they can just imagine chaos or corporate dominance, right? They imagine everyone fending for themselves. And that fear is understandable, but it rests on a false assumption. It assumes that without central authority, coordination just disappears. In reality, the opposite is true. Look closely at your own life for this. Most of the things you rely on every day are not centrally planned. There's no committee who decides which open source projects succeed. Right? There's no ministry assigns people to help neighbors after disasters. There's no authority plans for informal markets when official channels fail. So these systems function. They're not perfect. They're not necessarily even clean, but they do so resiliently. Open source software coordinates thousands of strangers across the world. No central planner assigns those tasks. People contribute where they see value. Bad ideas are rejected and good ideas spread. With informal markets, they appear instantly when formal ones break down. Things like black markets, not because people are greedy, but because prices tell the truth when official channels don't. There are distortions, for sure, but it just shows that spontaneous orders still abound. And another thing, after natural disasters, neighbors help neighbors long before agencies arrive. I know, I was in the hurricane in West North Carolina, and I definitely saw this firsthand. There's no permissions you have to do, no paperwork, just action. We were able to go knock door to door on hundreds of doors, giving away medicines and toilet paper, food, etc. So we were there first before FEMA and the rest of them. Reputation-based systems, they work quietly every day. People trade and hire, they collaborate, they lend based on trust and past track records and experience. It's not through central authority. These systems, they share a few traits. So participation is voluntary. Exit, once again, is possible. Failure is local. And feedback is almost instantaneous. Whereas central systems, they're so far behind, it can take them a while to change. Rules that were enforced today, they were made years and years ago and probably outdated. So many things that are outdated with the state. The state's always behind the curve. So these problems that we find that markets can solve, they're not perfect, but they're correctable. And that matters actually way more than perfection, especially the ability of exit. So voluntary coordination rarely announces itself, right? It doesn't issue press releases like politicians. It doesn't hold ceremonies. It doesn't try to claim all this credit like politicians do in parties and special interests. Right? It just works quietly. It doesn't have a cheerleader. And it works until something interrupts it. And sadly, the only interruption that we've seen in history is power. It's the only real interruption for freedom. So there is an idea many people hold without ever even saying it out loud, and that is that economic freedom and personal freedom are separate things, right? You even see that this political party defends economic freedom, the other one defends personal freedom. That you can control prices and wages and jobs and trade without affecting speech or movement or privacy, like they can be individually segmented. But history completely does not support that belief at all. When the state controls economic life, it has to know who is producing, who is trading, who is hoarding, who is leaving, who is refusing. That information doesn't collect itself, and it's already information starved. And so, leaders are trying to get information that they can't necessarily get, and they have to know everything about all the things that are going on. It requires constant monitoring. And once monitoring exists, the enforcement has to follow. And of course, once the enforcement follows, dissent becomes an economic problem, not just a political one. If you control food distribution, you control who eats. If you control employment, you control who works. If you control housing, you control where people live. At that point, speech stops being free. Not because anyone passes a speech law, but because saying the wrong thing can cost you access to necessities. And this is why censorship and surveillance and travel restrictions and policing always expand alongside economic control. Not as an abuse, as a requirement of socialism and statism. Economic freedom isn't just about markets, it's about the ability to say no without punishment. And when that disappears, personal freedom disappears with it. I want to talk about why taxation changes everything, right? There's a phrase people repeat without thinking too much about it, and that taxation is the price of civilization, right? But funding mechanisms matter. And when funding is compulsory, failure is inherent, it's insulated. A program does not have to persuade anyone to continue existing. It simply collects more. When funding is voluntary, failure is immediate. People stop paying for what doesn't work. And that difference explains more about state behavior than any ideology ever has. Because compulsory funding breaks the feedback loop. It allows systems to grow without proving their value. And once that loop is broken, expansion becomes the default. The problems just keep going. It keeps growing, but value is not really being produced. And this is how statism regenerates. Almost every major expansion of state power begins with an emergency. You have war or economic crisis or terrorism or some kind of a pandemic. And those could be real things, but of course the state's going to take advantage of them, right? The argument's always the same. This is just temporary, it's necessary, this is different this time, right? But temporary powers have a habit of becoming permanent. There's nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. Each crisis lowers the threshold for the next expansion, right? Each suspension of freedom becomes the new baseline. So a system that requires freedom to be suspended in order to survive is basically admitting its own fragility. There's actually a responsibility contradiction here as well. There's another belief that quietly props up statism, that people are too irresponsible to govern themselves, that they need to be managed. But notice the contradiction here. The same people deemed too irresponsible to choose freely are considered responsible enough to choose who governs everyone else. If people are too dangerous to govern themselves, they are far too dangerous to have governance over others. Once again, this isn't even ideology, it's just basic logic, it's basic contradictions, it's basic rationality and reason. Now, I want to also touch on why reform never really reaches the root, right? At this stage, many people retreat to, we're just going to continue to reform. That's the common theme, right? You can never get rid of a program. You can just reform it. You can reform all day long. It's the reform. That's the name of the game. If you go to DC, they accept the critique, but they believe the solution is better rules, right? Just more oversight, more transparency, more accountability at the state, more power, more money. But reforms change policies, but they don't change incentives of the structure. States do not shrink through reform. They change shape, they change language, they change justification or reasoning, but the power does not disappear, it just relocates. And without changing the underlying incentives, reform only rearranges the control. So, at some point, this stops being a debate about socialism versus capitalism. Socialism isn't just the disease, it's a symptom of a deeper belief that some people should have authority to override others for their own good. And once that premise is accepted, the only remaining question is scale. How much control? How much enforcement? How much permission? Statism is the root, and socialism is one of the branches. Letting go of ideas you believe for good reason isn't easy. It wasn't for me. I didn't stop believing in socialism because I stopped caring about people. I stopped believing in socialism because I couldn't keep ignoring the gap between what it promised and what it actually produced. At some point, caring about people means caring about what actually works, not what sounds right. That realization isn't dramatic, it's quiet. But once it settles in, it changes how you see everything. Every system eventually answers one question. What happens to the individual when the plan fails? Under state socialism, under statism more broadly, the answer is consistent. The individual must adapt, comply, or disappear quietly from the story. And this is why exit is restricted. This is why truth becomes dangerous. This is why permission expands. None of this even requires evil people. It just requires a system that cannot tolerate refusal, which ends up making evil people out of non-evil people. So if a society must stop people from leaving in order to survive, it is not protecting them, it is protecting the plan. History has already told us who pays the price when that trade is made.